Hello and welcome to the beautiful Shipley Glen, and in this video we're going to be delving into a lot of the historic attractions that appeared here in the Victorian heyday. Let's start down the bottom of Prod Lane and towards the Shipley Glen Tramway. So here we are at the end of Prod Lane and the other side of Shipley Glen, and who remembers right here there being some vintage Dodgem cars on this plinth right here. I remember as a kid walking up the path or getting a tram, which is just here, the tramway, and coming out and seeing these old retro Dodgems from the 1920s, or they look like it anyway. The cars were really old, and it was just one attraction right here, run by the same family for a long time, I'm told anyway. But as you can see, they were demolished probably, I don't know, 20 years ago now. They did sit here abandoned for a long time, and they ended up getting demolished because they needed too much money spending on them. And obviously the foot traffic, as you can see, is no longer here. So the things like this, if you don't use it, you will lose it. So all the people would have come up, the visitors would have come up from the tramway this way, from Saltaire. Right at the top here was the famous Shipley Glen Children's Fun Fair. Now this fun fair I remember as a kid. It was a necessary stop when you got off the tram up here to nip in there and have a couple of rides. I remember them being like 20 and 30 pence each a ride. But more than that, there was a famous ride inside there called the Aerial Glide that back in the 80s and 90s, not many people appreciated its historic value. It's only now that it's gone that people realised how historic this attraction was. So the fairground took up everything that you see where these new houses are, all the way up there now. All this site here, it wasn't very big. It was only a very narrow piece of land that went to the cliff edge just over there. And the Aerial Glide was literally where these 2 or 3 houses are here, just on the hillside. And you had a little cafe area there, and this was the main gate into the fun fair, and the rest of the fairground rides were up here. But you also had vintage rides in there. I'm talking rides from the 1930s, 1920s that still existed even in its later years, and also slot machines, like vintage slot machines. It was one of those quirky little places that you just have to see. Now unfortunately there was a massive battle at the time to keep this park open, and unfortunately, as you can see, the owner at the time decided to give in to the developers and sell his land for a lot of money, no doubt, instead of keeping the fairground open, which was still profitable. They forced the current tenants out and then sold it for housing, which is a big, big shame, because not only is it a blow to the tramway, which a lot of the visitors to the fun fair would have used the tramway, but also Shipley Glen and Bradford as a whole, because it's something that you would remember as a kid coming and doing. Unfortunately today, just more houses. I know we need them. Why right there? I mean, there's tons of land up here they could have built houses on, but they chose right there. I mean, it's not as if you get the views. You can't see anything behind the trees. We're going to take a look at one of the most memorable and probably the most missed attraction, and that was the famous Shipley Glen Pleasure Grounds. It went by numerous names over the years, from just the Shipley Glen Fun Fair to Pleasure Grounds, and in its later years, the Children's Fun Fair. As many of the Victorian attractions on the Glen came and went, presumably the ones that had less accidents, the pleasure grounds lasted right up until 2005. It started its life around 1895 as a thriving tea shop and zoo. An exact date is not known, but the fun fair rides started to appear at the turn of the century. The zoo was known as the Menagerie and once housed a lion and a bear. The park grew in size and became very popular with visiting families to the top of the Glen. The zoo at this point was sidelined and eventually emptied to accommodate more rides. It was upon the opening of the pleasure grounds that the first iteration of the famous Aerial Glide roller coaster opened, but we'll cover that in more detail later in this video. The pleasure grounds provided many people with endless fun all throughout the 1900s, with some of the earlier attractions still operating up until its closure. The site was bought by the Teal family in 1966, who owned the nearby house and the land the fairground operated from. Slowly they started to sell off patches of land around the area to accommodate housing, encroaching on the boundary of the funfair. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable would happen. It was operated by Paul Teal himself for many years, until in 1986 when the pleasure grounds were leased out to an independent operator who came from generations of fairground showmen. It was managed by a Mr. Alan Breeze, who ran the funfair from 1986 until its closure. When they took over the lease, they also added some newer attractions to accompany the older rides. Even though visitor numbers to the Glen declined over the years, the funfair was still profitable. The aerial glide roller coaster closed in 2002 and was sat rotting away for a couple of years whilst the park still operated. As house prices rose and the land that it sat on became very valuable, Mr. Teal announced in 2005 that the rent on the land would be going up to match the value of the land. This meant that the little profit that Mr. Breeze made would now only pay the difference in rent hikes, essentially forcing the closure of the fairground. And according to Mr. Teal, there were no plans for anything on the site at that time, even though plans had already been submitted for multiple dwellings on the site. The Children's Funfair, as it was known then, finally closed its gates on the 4th of September 2005. It was hoped that getting the aerial glide listed would put an end to any plans for housing. We'll come to this a bit later in the video. The rides that were owned by Mr. Breeze was sold off, and all that remained were the buildings and an empty patch of land. So let's head down to the site today and see what became of it, and also see if we can find any remains of its past. So right now I would have been walking inside the fairground and I would have been stood right in the middle of it now. So what I'm going to do is a little photo fade from here, just to show you what it used to look like looking where I'm stood right now. And it just looks so different with those houses. The actual elevation on the land is exactly as it was. I mean, it was pretty flat anyway. Right up to the house in the distance. Like I say, I remember coming in here and you can see an old gate there from the roadside into the fairground. And also some of the original buildings that I remember that used to be here. If I remember rightly, when you exited the top end at this section here, there was a little, or an old, like a zoo that used to be here, a Victorian zoo. They had little boxes with cages on that would have housed lions and animals and things like that, which obviously didn't exist even when I was a kid, but they were here. The boxes or the cages were still here, which is weird to see. So let's do one more picture looking back towards me and you'll see what the fairground looked like in this direction. I've just had a little memory from when I was a kid, and I believe I remember seeing a picture of a little window, a little slot in the wall there, so you could see into the animal cages that used to be here. I wonder if that's what that is on the wall there. The aerial glide was a roller coaster that held significant historic values, although it wasn't appreciated at the time. It's believed it opened with the pleasure grounds at the end of the 1800s, although an exact date is still not known. It had a rectangle-shaped footprint located at the top of the pleasure grounds and utilising a steep slope that would be unusable for any other attraction. It's not known who designed or built the ride, but most probably built by the park owners themselves at the time. What was also not realised was that this was the first suspended roller coaster in the world that we know of. But here was an older version lurking in the trees at some little-known fairground in Bradford. You would buy your token for the ride, which when I was a child was around 45 pence. Head over to the caged entrance and hand over your token to the operator, and then sit down in nothing more than a metal suspended chair that had a wooden seat. They placed a chain across your lap, although I doubt that these were in place before I rode it, and then you would get a shove down the track, coasting gently down the rail, swinging quite violently to the left as you hit the two wobbly corners banking to the right. The whole frame would rattle and shake, then hoping that you may have a gentle stop as you hurtled down the final straight section with some speed. There were no brakes on this thing. It relied on some oiled up guy catching you at the bottom and stopping you hitting the wall on the final bend. You would then exit the seat and head up the stairs alongside its final section, where the chairs were sent up a chain lift back to the top. I never understood as a kid why you could never stay in the seat whilst it climbed up the chain lift. Originally the seats held 2 passengers at a time, but as the ride aged, it was down to a single rider per seat on its 4 cars, weighing no more than 12 stones. By the turn of the millennium, the ride was in need of some major repairs, and probably had expensive insurance premiums. It was decided to close the ride in 2002, and it stood abandoned for 2 years more. So this is the site where the aerial glide used to run. So roughly where that house is, the station was a couple of houses up there and ran down towards the camera and back on this bottom end here. All now people's gardens or back gardens, and also this little pathway at the back here. But this is where the boundary was, where this wall is now. But it is hard to imagine it now, just looking at this wall here, that just over that wall was one of the oldest operating rides in Europe. And not a lot of people appreciated what it was at the time, and it was a roller coaster. It rolled down the track and it had a lift hill as well, but not anymore because it's all completely gone. By 2003, it had become clear that Mr. Teal had intentions of demolishing the ride to build houses, after plans were submitted to the council the year before. It was at this point that people became interested in its history. They unearthed numerous historic facts about the ride, and hoped to use them to get the ride Grade 2 listed status, which would also prevent the development from happening. It actually gained some national coverage and alerted people outside of Bradford to its existence and importance. Once Mr. Teal learned of its importance, it was rumoured that he would commence with its demolition to stop any efforts to thwart his plans for the site. Some local residents, in conjunction with Nick Lester, who ran an online historic fairground bookstore called Joyland Books, submitted an urgent application for its listing. Nick had done the same a few years prior with the scenic railway at Margate's Dreamland. He was successful in getting it listed, and because of that, it still operates to this day. They successfully secured a Grade 2 listed building status for the ride, based on its historic merit and age of the attraction. The stop notice was delivered through Mr. Teal's door and the ride would be saved. That was until he started to dismantle the ride some weeks later. Locals heard the sound of a cutting disc whirring away. The council and police were called, who attended and put a halt to Mr. Teal's attempt to secretly demolish the listed attraction. When it was listed, it was strongly believed that this steel version of the coaster was the original built in the early 1900s. But some footage appeared from 1920 that showed that the original was made from wood, which meant that the steel version was a later reincarnation from around the 1930s. This was used by Mr. Teal and the fact that the ride had corroded beyond repair. Inspectors from Historic England attended and inspected the ride, with them delisting it as no longer of historic value. Upon this news in July 2004, Mr. Teal powered up his disc cutter and scrapped the ride in record time. The ride was no more. What we're going to take a look at next is what was known as the Japanese Gardens, which was just a house on the right up here. Now you won't see much today. I'll try and get you a drone shot of that. But the actual Japanese garden layout is still there, even though there's a house built on the site now. So the Japanese Gardens was situated right behind this house. I'm going to zoom in for you and you can just see some trees on a little island in the garden. They were the original trees and the original plants on the centre. And you can just see, if I zoom in, a little bit of a wall there. That's again from the original Japanese Gardens. And I didn't think that that wall was still there. But it's basically a concrete wall that the owner built. It was basically a guy that owned a house next to the Japanese Gardens here. And he built these gardens to catch the tourists walking up and down to the tramway and come in. And he had a little boat ride and a couple of fairground rides and also something called the Chicken, which apparently was some form of, I don't know, like a merry-go-round that came from Blackpool Pleasure Beach that was situated there as well. And the boat ride used to go around the island, and he also had all these concrete walls that he built himself, and it made them look like a grotto or a castle, and they actually had a grotto in there as well. So it was all very surreal and strange. When you look at it now, it's a residential street, but it always was. There's not as many houses on it back then, but there were still houses here. And you walk down and you wouldn't think this was some kind of an attraction, but all the houses along this street had some kind of a tea room at the end of the garden or a cafe and little attractions in the garden. There's also another one just further up here, which we'll check out shortly. So this would have been the entrance into the Japanese Gardens, and they were just on the left up here. Now it's a private property today, so we can't head in there and show you. And there's houses built on the back of it, and also this house on the front, which wasn't here originally. So let's get the drone up and I'll try zoom in for you, just so you can see the layout of the garden from above. It's nothing that you can't see from Google Earth, so I'm not trespassing or anything like that. But you can see the layout right there, that's still there today. Now what you can see is the little island in the middle where the boat ride would have gone round, and you can still see on the bottom left there part of the original grotto that still survives today. So you have the tramway at the end, then you've got the fairground that was here on the right, the Japanese Gardens and tea rooms, and also something a bit further up, but we'll keep heading on. So as we're heading up towards the Glen and up Prod Lane, right there where those new houses are, and again they're not that new, but new in terms of what was here back in the day. All of this land here was part of the Glen pub, which is just up here, or which used to be a hotel with attractions, and one of the original sections of Shipley Glen. We'll have a look at that shortly. But all this land here had attractions on it as well. And right there where these houses are was a large circular railway, which obviously isn't there today, and there's no sign of it whatsoever, because it's directly where that house is in the middle there. And what it was just basically what it says on the name, a circular railway. It used to go round in a circle. So I'm told a little rumour, and again I don't know how true this is, the original Switchback Railway, which we will take a look at shortly on the Glen, came from the Saltaire exhibition in the 1800s, and basically it came with 4 or 5 cars, and what they did was they reused them. So they were bought by the entrepreneur up here on the Glen, and he reused the cars on multiple attractions. So one of them, or 2 of them, was used on the circular railway in the garden down here, and then he used 2 of them on the Switchback Railway, and also I'm told 2 of them may have been used on the aerial flight, which again is up on the Glen. We've reached the top of Prod Lane and what is the Old Glen House, which is still here today and still having a roaring trade, which is good to see. But this was one of the original attractions at the top here, and it's where a lot of the Victorian stuff here started. They basically turned this into a bit of a tea room and a hotel and a bar, and they built a load of attractions in the car park down here and on the land of the property, which, like I said, in the old days used to go all the way down here. But it's now, as you can see, covered in housing, and that circular railway that we were looking at was just down there where the big house is. And they still have the pub today, and also they still have a tea room. We're now making our way onto the actual Glen, which they believe was formed in the Ice Age, hence all the massive boulders that's up here. We've just left the Old Glen House, which, like I said, was one of the original attractions here on the Glen. There's lots of strange rock formations up here. Some of them have very, very old carvings in them and strange markings as well. There's lots of myths, legends and tales of what happened up here many years ago. There's even a stone circle up here, a very old stone circle, but it's a great place to bring the kids. I used to come up here as a child all the time. We loved the little caves and the little clambering around the boulders and everything like that, looking for the patterns in the stones, and then having an ice cream, obviously, at the pub. But why don't you come, get the tram up, have a look around the glen, and then get the tram back down. That'll be a great day out. So I'm going to do a photo fade now, taken from here on the glen, looking towards the Old Glen House pub, and it shows a very busy Shipley Glen. And I don't think it's that old, this photo, probably 1970s, 60s maybe. But I found the exact stones that's in the photograph. So let's cut to the photo fade now, and you'll see those two stones right there in the picture. But it's taken me about 40 minutes to find the exact stones. So we're now approaching Bracken Hall, which is a free museum run by the council all about the area and Shipley Glen. It's in this building right behind me here. So we'll pop in there and have a look round. But it's also the location of where they had the original Switchback Railway. I'll put the date in down below. But it was one of the earliest roller coasters in the UK at the time. Probably not the first, but one of the first. So let's have a look at the museum, and then we'll take a look at the location of the Switchback Railway. There's lots of displays in here of how the rocks are formed in the area and what they're made out of, and also things that have been found on the rocks over the years, and some of the strange patterns in the stones that I was talking about, but also location of the original function of Shipley Glen, which was all the mining in the area. So you can see here all these little orange dots represent all the bell pits, and a little bit of information there as well on all the various Victorian attractions that used to be up here on the glen, which we're taking a look at in these next few videos. So let's head down the side of Bracken Hall Countryside Centre, and I'm going to show you the location of the Switchback Railway, which was down the side of the building. Now this Switchback Railway, like I said, came from the Saltaire exhibition in the 1800s, and it was moved up here when they didn't need it any longer. But it was located right about here in front of us, so the station building would have been roughly where this patch of grass is in front, and it ran towards that barn at the back and back again. But what I'm going to do is do a photo fade taken from over here, looking at the station building here. So here we are further up the driveway now, and I'm stood roughly where the Switchback Railway would have been, in a line from over here and straight across there. So this would have been a piece of spare land back in the day next to the houses and the farm here. What I'm going to do now is do something a bit different. It's going to be a photo fade, but from a video. So we'll hopefully try capture the Switchback Railway from here. Now we aren't finished yet. There's still a couple more attractions, big ones, that were up here. But these attractions disappeared in the early 1900s, one of them in 1900. So there is nothing to see of that today. But we might be able to find some clues to their existence up here on the glen. So let's start with our first ride today, which was known as the aerial flight. Now this was not to be confused with the aerial glide, which was down in the funfair, which was the oldest roller coaster. This one was a Victorian cable car system, or it looked like anyway. you had two cables suspended between two towers, like a modern day cable system, and you had a car that ran between them on the slope, basically like a zip line but in a car. Very strange. There was a few of these around the country and around the world, not just here. This one was one of the 1800s ones. There's also one at Rakes Hall in Blackpool, which I did a video about as well. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. And the only other one that I know about was here at Shipley Glen. So the first thing we're going to do is look for the top loading station, which I'll put in a picture of it now. And you can see the staircase as it leads up to the loading platform, which was the highest point where you would have boarded. And then it descended down the hill towards the Old Glen House and another station at the bottom down there. We will go take a look at that later and see if we can find any remains of anything down there. But for now, we're going to start up here. And I do remember when I came up here as a kid, we used to see bolt holes in the rocks and also hooks and giant metal clamps. And I always wondered what they were. So let's see if we can find them. So what we're looking for is something that disappeared 100 years ago. I believe it closed in the 1920s, but there was a flat piece of rock somewhere up here that has loads of bolt holes and anchor points in it. And if I remember rightly as a kid, it was a bit further up here on the left. So I've reached the point where I believe it was, and I can see them already. I can see some metal anchor points right there on the rocks. And I do remember these as a kid and tripping over them. So let's get a closer look at these. So here we go. Right here on this flat mound would have been the large lattice tower up here with the staircase and the cables heading off in that direction. Obviously these trees would have been not here then. But let's have a closer look at these. You can see how far they're driven in. So they're over 120 years old and they are still as solid today as they were back then. Look like iron or steel. And another one just over here, exactly the same. So these would have been anchor points for the tower. And as you can see, quite a steep drop down there into the valley. And that's the rough site of where the toboggan room was, somewhere over here. We'll go take a look at that after this. And another piece of metal just over here. Some kind of a metal ring there, or a clamp. I wonder if that was the cable or something. It looks like it, because they would have had to anchor the cables down at some point. Now I believe that might be all that is up here in terms of the remains of it. I will keep scouring around in case I find anything else. But I do remember as a kid clambering around inside all these little caves under the rocks down here and seeing these little things and wondering what they were. And that's probably why I got into history. I remember my dad telling me at the time, oh, this used to be for a roller coaster or a ride. And that fascinated me so much. Being into rides and roller coasters, that got me into history. And just here to the side is where the stairs from the platform, so the platform was there, the stairs would have come down here and mounted somewhere here. And if you just look down, again, you can see like a hole there where maybe a metal clamp or mount would have gone, and maybe another one there. So I believe this was the end of the ramp, as you can see in this picture. And then, so you would have boarded here, got up the stairs, up there, and headed off down the bottom end. We're now down the bottom end of the site of where the aerial ropeway would have come down. And you've got the pub, the Old Glen, just behind there. And the top station was directly up there, quite a fair way up. It's hard to see because of this tree. Now I'm looking around here because there's not any obvious signs of rocks and things, but I did just spot this again down here, another hole in the rock, which could lead to a pillar maybe being sat in there. It's the only sign I've seen so far. And we'll just head up here. So the bottom pillar would have been down here somewhere, the bottom tower. And I believe it obviously headed down this way on a gradient. So yeah, that is all that remains down here, just that little hole in the rock. But it's still evidence that it was here. I'll just show you one more picture, which came to light today actually in the museum. And it shows a view from the aerial ropeway that I've not seen before. I've only got one photograph. Now the next thing we need to find is the toboggan run, which was quite well known actually. A lot of people are aware of it because of an accident that happened on the toboggan run. Now I believe it was somewhere on this top end here. So I need to find it because I've never seen it. And apparently there is evidence of its existence all the way down the hill as well. So we'll find that hopefully. What I do want to do is just mention a lot of people when they see this picture of the toboggan, they confuse it because it's got a tramway at the side of it as well. A lot of people confuse that with the Shipley Glen tramway, which is right down the bottom end of here, probably half a mile away. It's not that one. This was a separate one altogether, and it was located up here on the top side of the glen. And what they did was they went down on the toboggans and then they used the trolleys to come back up the hill. But the trolleys were very similar, and it was a similar system to the one at Shipley Glen tramway, but not quite as big. So what I'm looking for up here is a clearing in the trees heading down the hill, because apparently that is a sure sign of where it was, because the trees never grew back as much. I think we may have found it. You can see the dense foliage on that side and the same over there, and there's a gap, a clear gap down here. So let's head up onto this rock and see if we can see the route down. If we can, then I think we're in the right place, and then we'll start making our way down the hillside and hopefully find some remains on the way down. Yeah, this looks like it to me. Yeah, I think this is definitely the right spot. And to prove it, I'm going to fade in this picture from the top, which shows the owner of the attraction, his wife and his daughters in the picture as well, and some of the earliest passengers. And it was known as the toboggan slide. Now, like I said, it did have an accident, and we will cover that when we get to the bottom. So another bit of evidence at the top here, 100% confirms it. There's a lot of holes in the rocks here, and again here, bits of metal sticking out of the rocks, as you can see right there, which would have been clamps for the wood, and the two more right there, look. One there and one there. So these would have been like metal braces or clamps holding the wood platform to the rocks as it headed off down that way. Now, just to prove I'm in the right location, so I was just stood up there where that tree is, and if you just see this rock right in the middle here, and then I'll show you another picture taken from the bottom side looking up, and you see the line in the rock down the middle, you can clearly see that on this photograph. So it was positioned right here above us and heading down into the valley this way. And I've just seen our first piece of evidence down here to suggest that there was something mounted on these rocks, because it was a wooden platform heading down in a straight line, and that was bolted to the rocks. If you just look in the rocks here, you can see some marks where some wooden, probably sleepers, would have sat to support the structure right there. So now we know exactly where it was, which is something I've wanted to know for many years, but I have to come and see it for myself. This is the exact route the toboggan would have took down the hill through here. You can see the trees are a bit more, a bit less mature here, shall we say, than the ones on the other side. So what we'll do is we'll make it down to the bottom and see if there's anything on the way down. And when we get down there, I'm going to do another photo fade looking back, and then I'm going to tell you about the accident that happened down the bottom. I'm about a third of the way down, and there's some more evidence of footings here, look. Same as above in the rocks. Lots of these holes all the way down. I can see another one on that rock right there. We're at the point on the toboggan run now where it would have started to level out as it got down towards the reservoir at the bottom here. And you can see it's much less steeper here. But I'm going to show you a picture which actually explains the accident a little bit. Now, what happened was you go down the hill on two toboggans and then you catch a tram back up. Like I said earlier, the tram is very similar to the Shipley Glen tramway. So on that fateful day in 1900, some passengers had descended down the hill on the toboggans. They boarded the tram to come back up the hill. But as the tram headed up, one of the ladies lost a hat or an item off her person. They stopped the tram for her to retrieve it at the side of the track. But in doing that, it meant that the cable detached from the drum or the winding wheel at the top of the hill, and in doing so meant that the tram was now free falling all the way down. They didn't have auto braking like they do today on the modern tramways, and the tram rolled all the way back down. I don't think it was quite at the top, but it rolled down to the bottom. As it was making its way down the hill, 2 passengers threw themselves off the tram and rolled into the hedge. They only injured themselves slightly, and as the tram hit the bottom, now I believe there was 8 or 10 people in it at the time, it threw all the passengers out at the bottom. But miraculously, not one person died. As a result of that, they closed the toboggan run immediately, and it never reopened again. So that was its last operating year after 3 or 4 years of running. And that was on the Whit Monday of 1900. We've reached a clearing now at the bottom where it would have terminated, and you've got the reservoir just here, which was made in the early 1900s, about 1910 or something, and that was to power the dye works for Salt's Mill just further down there. We'll have a look at that in a second, but this is roughly where the end of the line would have been for the toboggan run, and again a dead giveaway, another one of those square holes in the rocks right there, and this tree is right in the way, so that is definitely a new tree, but it would have ended right about here. Now it's hard to see because again these are new saplings, but that's a direct line up the hill. So what I'm going to do is do another photo fade, and on this image here, looking back up the hill, you can see where the cable has disappeared from the image on the lift back up the top. There's one of the cables missing. How amazing would it be today to have a modern version of a toboggan ride down this hillside? There's lots of them around the world now, the modern ones with magnetic braking. They're brilliant. Made by Wiegand in Germany. And there's one in Wales actually, a very good one. They could do with one right here. Not only would it bring a lot of people back to the Glen and to use the tramway, but also it'd be a fantastic run down there. Well, there we go. I've had a scout round and I can't see any more evidence of anything down here. I was maybe hoping to find a couple of pieces of timber, but I mean, you're talking over 100 years ago, probably not going to happen. Anyway, let's take a quick look at this reservoir down here. This is what is known as Crag Well, which runs all the way through the valley here, and this runs into what would have been a big steel dam at one point. We've got a sluice gate just down here, and then the reservoir is just on the left here with a little diversion around the back there. So like I said, this was built to power the dye works for Salt's Mill. So a lot of it is connected to the area. We've got this, looks like a handle. Would that have been for the sluice gate, I wonder? I love old things like this, trying to work out what it is. But that's how I found the toboggan, because I know somebody said it ended roughly where the reservoir was. So I knew roughly the area that it would be in. Thank you for joining us across this series at Shipley Glen. I hope you enjoyed a look at the many attractions that existed here and the ones that still do. I'll see you on the next video.